Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I've had an extra hour in bed, so it won't be, even if I'm boring as I might be, you should not be driven to sleep. Anyway, for you since you've got me this morning to host this, I'm Tom Westley. I'm a director of the club and on the committee of management since 2013, and I've been a regular competitor in Concours over many, many years. So it's my privilege and delight to be able to talk to you this morning. And we're going to talk about specifically the DBS model, which was first revealed at Blenheim Palace on the 25th of September 1967. It was for Aston Martin a big step because previously the DB4 was the sort of state-of-the-art iteration in the late 50s, using Touring of Milan to do the styling, which was very sexy, and their very latest building technologies, the Superleggera techniques, and that sort of ethos and style followed right the way through to the DB6. It was generally acknowledged to be a state-of-the-art car way back then, with the engine and with everything about it being competitive with Ferrari and the best in the world. So they'd sort of run out of steam to some degree by the time we got to the last of the DB6s in terms of styling, and they very much wanted to create something which looked more modern, in inverted commas. And they charged Touring of Milan to come up with some designs, which they did, and they weren't overly impressed because they thought they were a bit too fussy. But they this time had got a chap working with them called William Townes, who started out life with Roots Group. He started in his 20s designing seats and bits and pieces, but he finished up designing the Hillman Hunter. If any of you can remember that, it was quite a sharp angled car and modern for its time, and the derivatives of that which Roots did. But anyway, Aston Martin hired him, brought him into the fold, and it was he who penned the style and shape of what became the DBS. And Aston Martin directors chose his design over the Touring option at that time because they thought it was a lot sharper and looked more modern. They were motivated to redesign the car, not just to make it modern, but also to make it able to contain a V8 engine, because their ambition was to sell more cars in America, and America had got more cash than most. So the Americans were sort of top of their agenda to try and make it look as good as they could, to be appealing to them, and also ultimately to have a V8 engine in it. And William Townes, took that as a challenge. At one point, he actually said the rear of it was a bit inspired by the Mustang, Ford Mustang. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but certainly the front of it was absolutely modern, and the twin headlamps and the square nature of it was something very much different from the traditional styles. And that was a problem to Aston Martin to some degree, because the more traditional customers actually loved the rounded traditional shape Aston, and they're a bit upset by something quite as radical as that. On the other hand, of course, others preferred the modern one and weren't so happy about the old design. So what Aston did, interestingly, was built the two models side by side for 3 years, because they found that was the best way to sell the most cars. And they didn't actually cease building the DB6 Mark II. It had overlapped by, I say, a good 3 years. And interestingly, along the way, they actually shared parts, because they purposely tried to rationalize between the new DBS and the DB6. So the seats were the same, and some elements of the things that they made for both cars towards the end, in order that they could optimize their own costs. So what we know about the other element of it, of course, was that Tadek Marek was the guy responsible for sorting out this new V8 engine. And it was always the ambition of the company that the new V8 engine would be ready to go into the car at the same time as the DBS shape was announced. But sadly, that wasn't to be. Although Tadek Marek actually designed, these engines he designed absolutely himself from scratch. He got a good background. He was trained in the Berlin Technical University, although he was a Polish chap. And of course, the war intervened, But before the war, he had worked with both Fiat and General Motors in Poland, and he got very in-depth and very respected for his knowledge about engines. And he went after the war, he actually came to work at Austin and Longbridge to work on their 6-cylinder engines, and was subsequently hijacked by Aston Martin to help them develop some of their engines. I think it was in the late 1940s, early 50s that he joined Aston Martin, and he was involved in sort of upgrading the Lagonda, making the Lagonda 6-cylinder as good as it could be, and then developed the 6-cylinder engine that went in the DB4 car. He developed from scratch. So it was the aluminium cast block with a wet liner construction. It was a very sophisticated engine, which he built all the way from scratch. And of course, that became enormously successful and was the engine that was the basis of Aston Martin winning Le Mans in 1959 and so on. So the challenge for him to build a V8 was a greater one because he hadn't had that level of experience and been mainly working 6-cylinder engines, but he did nevertheless develop again from absolutely scratch this V8 engine. And in 1965, he actually fitted one of his own V8s into a DB5, which was his own car. And he played with that, and he realized that it was very difficult. He couldn't just alter the chassis in quite the way they needed to, and it was all going to be very expensive, which is what helped the liaison between the design of the body and the chassis and what was going to be the V8, so that they properly could come together in the end. But in the meantime, he wanted to test it, and he took this engine, which was then 5 litres capacity, was taken to Le Mans in 1967. And the team that was Lola, it was Team Surtees, John Surtees and Lola and Aston Martin got into bed together and put this car together to be competitive. And when this was the very, very first of these 5-litre V8 engines. And they were surprised themselves in testing because they were really quite competitive against Ferrari and Ford. And Ferrari and Ford were a bit, oh, wow, fancy this, Aston Martin and a load of other. Anyway, the bad news is when the race began and they got going, within the space of almost not much more than an hour and a half, Surtees, who was driving one of the cars, had managed to burn a hole in one of the pistons, and the other car sadly failed within 4 hours. And there were all sorts of issues with overheating and with the not being robust enough at the bottom of the casting where the crankshaft fitted and whatever. So although that was really bad news, and it was very humiliating for Tadej Marek and for Aston Martin to so publicly fail with this new engine, in inverted commas, it sort of set them back big time. But I would say retrospectively, it's probably the best thing that could happen, because he went back to the drawing board, beefed up the bottom of the engine, did everything that he'd found that was weak and was a problem. He completely re-engineered it and reconstructed the engine, including increasing the capacity of it from 5 litres to 5.3. So, and of course that, we all know now, retrospectively, became the basis of Aston Martin engines right the way through for 20 years. So it was really very, very clever what he did, and he came up with the right answers with something that was robust enough and good enough to do a fantastic job. But before then, because this engine wasn't ready, the cars were released with the straight 6 engine, which had been in the DB6 cars. And Chris Bolton is here with me now, who owns one of these lovely straight 6 engine cars. Would you like to say a little bit about them, Chris, without me going on all the time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think my car's lovely, but it's certainly one of the 803 that were made. DBS obviously came out, Tom was saying, before the DBS V8, and production run was approximately double that. So it's of no surprise that you've got just over 800 DBS and just over 400 DBS V8. So actually, throughout all of the DBS V8 production run, you could still buy a 6-cylinder DBS. And for a period of time, you could only buy, while the DBS V8 was available in the US, you could only buy a DBS. So DBS V8 was available, you could only buy a DBS in the US. So although I guess the DBS V8 naturally cannibalized some of the production, you still continue to get DBSs ordered right through to 1972. So the two are very connected, and when the DBS V8 came out, we saw pretty quickly a change in the DBS. Talked about homologation, if you like, between the parts of the DB6 Mark II and the DBS sharing seats, for example. The DBS and the DBS V8 share a lot of parts, but the DBS that was produced towards the latter end of production is quite a different design in many aspects to the DBS that started production. You've got some big visual changes. You've got the much larger black fiberglass front spoiler. You lose the side air vents. You've got deeper sill covers, and there are a lot of other changes. If you're taking these cars apart, parts are not always interchangeable. Little changes happen across a lot of the car, including the interior, and changes, for example, like the steering wheel. The steering wheel started off as being wooden, and then it progressed to being leather trimmed. I think even the early DBS V8s have wooden wheels, but the transition, as always with Aston Martin, isn't clear cut. There's actually a service bulletin for the change to the leather wheel, and you can see a real mix of cars. It's not sequential at all until all of a sudden all the cars move to the leather trimmed wheel. I'm guessing, Tom, your car is well into production, so your car will have the leather wheel.
Leather wheel, that's right. The little bit in the middle of the steering boss, sadly, is because it's plastic. It's got some cracks in mine, but they're just almost unobtainable today. Nobody wants to make them and so on. So it still has its original steering wheel and centre boss with a few minor little crazes in it. What we should also say, perhaps, is that, of course, these cars were the last cars built under David Brown's direct stewardship. So there was all the DB insignia and writing all over the cars was still very much in place. And then when company developments, eventually in 1972, when company developments carried on, they, in true Aston Martin style, like Chris says, they used up a few of the badges that got DB on them, but largely they dropped the DB designation from there on. Sorry, Chris, I interrupted you there.
On the steering wheels, many of you will be aware that very period wooden wheel with a very thin rim was prone to snapping. One of my wheels has been patched up with fishing wire to hold it all together. So you could see there was some improvement, but also I think some of the changes were probably to save money as well, maybe simplify production. So a real mixture, and certainly if you compared an end of production DBS or DBS V8 with one of the early DBSs, the early DBSs, well, the pre-production prototype had split bumpers just like the DB6. Actually, as they began to test that, they put a connection tube, if you like, between the two parts, make it look like the DBS bumper that we know now. And as you go into production, the first few dozen cars, the first few dozen DBSs have very different door cards with deep pockets in them and different center consoles and so on. So as you go through the cars, a lot of changes, and it helps. If you've got an original car, you can really get some way to identifying it through applying all these changes and knowing when they happened and what cars they were applied to.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Yeah. If you like, we could show us, Maria, some of the pictures now of the shape of the DBS V8, because this sort of sharp edge styling that William Towns was doing was his signature. Of course, he went on famously to designed the wedge Lagonda, which was pretty sharp across all its corners. And the Bulldog was also his car. And I didn't realize until I was reading a bit around this that he was responsible for designing the Jensen Healey as well later on, when because Jensen Motors used to build the Austin Healeys on their line, and when PMC took the contract away from them, they wanted to fill that space, and that was the birth of the Jensen Healey. So he did design quite a few cars, including as well at one time in his career the Rover BRM was a William Townes design. So I think looked at retrospectively, because my first Aston was a 1974 car, which was the single headlamp car. But now when I look at it retrospectively, I do think that initial interpretation with the twin headlamps and it's taking the entire width of the car is very purposeful, and it's still good looking to my eyes. And of course the car was 6 feet wide, which in that period was enormously wide. It was wider than the contemporary Rolls-Royce. It wasn't very long, but it was designed so you could be really comfortable inside the car. And it was very much gravitating towards the GT style of Aston Martin as opposed to the DB4, ultimate sports car starting point. So the way they were, and the way they've continued to develop the cars over the years is to be just that, the ultimate Grand Tourer. So yeah, can we see some more of those pictures of the different angles and things, please, Maria? Yeah, well, that's under the bonnet, which is a pretty good tangle of hardware there. But this, of course, is the V8 engine car. In fact, this is my own car when it was up for sale. I pinched the photographs from there and have since done quite a bit of work on it just to clean it up. But the mechanical fuel-injected original V8s were really very quick cars. They were, at the time, the fastest production four-seater motor car in the world. They do 160 miles per hour. But of course, they depended on the fuel injection. They were definitely over-fueled to extract that level of performance. So if you could do a little more than 10 miles per gallon, that's what you did. And you were just grateful that you were in something very fast, but it did cost you in petrol. So coming inside the car, you can see it's a lovely cabin, very comfortable with the leatherwork and armrests, and even a little cigarette lighter on the end of the armrest in those days. No steering lock on my car, because the early ones just had the ignition key and start in the middle of the dashboard there at the bottom. You can see in front of the gear lever. ZF 5-speed boxes with a dog leg, which are very, very pleasant and extremely robust. And the joy of these cars, really, when they're properly restored and gone through, because they're now, we're talking about cars that were now nearly 50 years old. They're extraordinarily usable and reliable. I've been through mine with a new clutch and balanced the prop shaft and done the mechanical injection systems on. It is utterly usable and totally compatible with modern day traffic. Brakes are good, power's good. I mean, we took my car, which we'll come to later, from London to Edinburgh last year on the club trip. So the inside, again, this just serves to demonstrate how the DBS of this era was truly a four-seater car. People could sit in the back of here quite comfortably. And I would argue the modern Astons today, the DB9s and derivatives and DB11s, are not as practical for a touring car as these cars were. You can absolutely seat four people in them. You've got a sensible sized boot. And that was the way the thing was designed, to be really comfortable and really usable. And it is. Next slide. So this is my car. It's one of the Concours. I'm not quite sure which one, actually. I know that the car next to me was presented by a chap, what's his name, the famous collector from Switzerland, Simon Kidston. And that was a quite immaculate thing. But again, you can see the contrast there between the original interpretation versus the later interpretation. So we're getting onto latest Vantage, which Simon's car is there. So it's up to your personal taste which you prefer. This is another picture just to show that the DB6 Mark II was built within a few months of the V8, so the cars were built in parallel, and it just again serves to demonstrate how Aston Martin at that point were keeping their options open as to whether people preferred the traditional shape or the more modern DBS shape, which went on really to serve the company all the way through. Another picture here at the Concours. Mark, can you tell me where that Concours was? Mark Donoghue. I think you may be muted. No, never mind. Anyway, that's it taken part there, and I say since I've owned it, I didn't have to paint it. The owner before me had painted it, and he'd done a really good job. He was a Belgian surgeon, quite a well-known car collector, and he had the car on the continent and had spent a lot of money on getting the coachwork in a great shape. So I was very lucky that I didn't need to spend money on that, and I put all the money into going through the powertrain, doing the suspension and all the bushes that go with that, changing the clutch, and then, as I say, taking the head off it, cleaning all of that, and going through the mechanical injection system, so that as far as we could to make it reliable and usable, and it's proved to be just that. It's great fun to use.
And Tom, what's the colour? What's the trim and what's the paint on your car?
Oh, it was aquamarine blue, and it was they called it natural, the upholstery. But that was its original specification, and it's never been altered. It's had several owners. I've got the history pretty much back with the car, but no one's ever changed the colour or messed with it. So it's I'm pleased to say it's in its original colour scheme. Yeah. No. So this is just for a bit of amusement. I went on following on from the V8 themes. I had several V8s, but at one time I owned this V8 Vantage, which was a lovely car. And some of you may know that my son Tom is now a Concours judge. He's now 27 years of age, but you might be amused to know that that was him 27 years ago attending a Concours for the first time, but clearly not as a judge. There we are. Next picture. Oh, this was on last year in May 2019 when we did the London to Edinburgh drive. And that was, since I'd done all the work on the car, I'd sort of taken it out on different trips and shaken it down and whatever. But this was the main opportunity to give it a really good run and to see that everything was working as it should. And I'm delighted to say, and a credit to the people who worked on the car for me, because I didn't do the mechanical work, I got others to do it. They'd done a great job, and she never missed a beat. It ran absolutely brilliantly, but it did serve to demonstrate that no matter how you drive the car, slowly or fast or whatever, you cannot get it to do more than about 11 miles to the gallon. That is what she does, but it does it with great panache, and it's great fun to use. So there we are. That was on the journey up there. Next one. That's my son Tom. We drove the car between us on that trip, and as I say, we were very lucky. The weather wasn't bad at all, and we had a most enjoyable visit, because we chose not to go on the motorways, or rather it was purposely designed that way because it was to replicate the way that the route that Lionel Martin had taken when he made the journey 100 years before then, whatever it was, or I can't remember what was celebrated, one of the anniversaries anyway, of when he went up to Edinburgh from London himself. So it followed more or less the route of the old A1, and some very pleasant countryside and features to admire. Right, next picture.
And your car, Tom, is one of 7 in that colour combination.
Is that right? That's interesting. Okay, I didn't know that. Yeah. So yeah, this is just showing off the lines of the car, and you can see how sharp the tops of the wing tops are. Really, it was quite well. I just think it's a very pretty and clever design that William Townes put together, and the sort of traditional Aston shape of the grille is reflected if you look at the little bulge in the middle, to sort of respect the heritage that's gone in that regard. Next picture. Oh, that was me. You can see we had definitely overeaten at this stage on the trip, but this was going over the border into Scotland, and again we were very lucky with the weather. We had some great roads to use in some good conditions. This was one of the places, because the idea was that you kept a log of places that we had to go through to comply with the same route that had been taken by Lionel Martin all those years ago. And this was an old railway station, which has subsequently become not part of our railway system, courtesy of Mr. Beeching, and it was a private house. But we tracked it down, and that was just to prove that we'd found it and gone the right way on our route. Next one. Oh yes, well here we are. Success. We finally made it to the Caledonian Hotel in Edinburgh, which was very prestigious and very lovely, and it was good to be able to have the car, properly loaded with all of our luggage and all the stuff, and being properly used what it was intended to be, a very luxurious grand tourer, so you can whiz from London to Edinburgh and totally enjoy it. And the Caledonian still remains a fabulous piece of British architecture to match the car, I suppose. Now, this is the wrong order. This is before we set off, but we set off from the same spot in central London where Lionel Martin had, which is sort of district of Highgate. Next. Oh, and that was, in the end, we split up. My son and I took the car back to home, and he took an MGA that we've got to do the North Coast 500 trip with his girlfriend. So altogether we had a very indulgent motoring 2019, but it was good fun. Now, next, this is outside Newport Pagnell work service, and this was a part of the celebration of the DBS V8s that took place, and we sort of met up there and went on to other places. So there's you can see other colour combinations there. I know, Chris, do you know the colours of those other two cars that are adjacent to mine?
Not immediately.
Okay, because I when I had my single headlamp car, which was a 1974 car, they described that as Oxford blue, and it looked very similar to the car on the right here. But I don't know. They did definitely change the names of the colours when company development started christening them all AMV8s, and the DB designations dropped. They sort of rationalised the colours, I think, at the same time.
Yeah. You've got Oxford blue DBS V8 certainly. Well, there's a few of them.
Right. Okay, next picture. And this was our gathering at Blenheim Palace, and you can see lots of DBSs there. This again was 2019 to celebrate the anniversary, and there was a really good attendance. And once again, we were blessed with good weather, and it was a great opportunity to see lots of lovely DBSs, all in excellent working order, and many of them in immaculate condition. This is a gentleman who used to work on the cars at Newport Pagnell. Sadly, I can't remember his name now, but he was very knowledgeable about the mechanical fuel injection systems particularly, and about a lot of the history. And he was a delight to be talking to, because he was remembering all the problems. Because you may or may not know that again, with the V8 cars and the mechanical fuel injection system, they were something of a nightmare in the early days, because they were not as reliable as they should have been. And I think neither the dealers nor the company were very familiar with working on fuel injection systems. And it was the early days. It was the same system actually was used by Mercedes-Benz in their contemporary cars, and the 3.5 litres and the 6.3 litre V8 Mercedes engines use the same system, but somehow they seemed to be work better, or they were better able to adjust them and tune them. The company and many customers had a right struggle to get them to run as sweetly as they would like, and quite a few customers in period, and sometimes with the factory's advice, actually changed them away from the mechanical fuel injection system and put them onto Weber carburetors on purpose to make them easier to maintain and more reliable in terms of the fluctuations that you got. And so, but of course, retrospectively, that was not a great thing to do, because we like to keep originality. And of course, the other thing that's changed now is that many of the bits and pieces that you need and the stuff has been learned, so that if you rebuild systems properly now, they're better than they ever were in period, that's for sure. Right, next picture. The famous Persuaders car. This was at the London Palace Show, and many of you probably know that it was designed to look like a V8, although actually, again, when the film people, TV production people wanted the car, the V8 engine wasn't available. So this is actually a 6-cylinder car supplied by the factory for this job, but cunningly disguised to look like a V8 in every way. And of course, the V8s always had the alloy wheels. They were cast alloy, GK and Kent alloys made them, because the torque from the V8 was too much for the wire wheels to stand. And you can tell as well, cars that have got the fuel injection system versus those who've got the carburetor system, because the bonnet scoop is nice and slim and thin, like this car is here, for the injection system, because it's sits quite tight on top of the engine. Whereas when you put the carburetors on, they start to interfere with the bonnet, and the later cars had bonnets with a bigger bulge on to accommodate the carburetors.
This is
sorry, Chris.
This is chassis 5636. So this is this is the new design with the deeper front spoiler, but it's not right at the end of production yet.
It's been much shown over the last few years, and is in absolutely immaculate condition today. Now,
we have a lot of questions about colours and specs. I saw that the next slide that Maria had.
Right.
And the number of colours, actually, although we had twice as many DBS made, the number of colours available are used for the DBS versus DBS V8 is very similar. So DBS V8 had a far greater range, if you like, across their production, smaller production. For the DBS, so look at just at DBS, you've got 61 exterior colours across the production run. That wouldn't fit into my chart, so I've just given you the top 10. And we'll look at the top 10 for DBS V8 as well in a minute, but they're very similar, actually. I think the first three are the same, and probably 8 out of 10 or so of the top 10 are the same as well. So all very standard period colours. But yeah, I mean, each of the DBS and DBS V8 had 23 colours that were assigned just to one car. So you can see how bespoke these were. I've got a colour, I think, is it for the DBS V8, called London Brick. So, quite possible that somebody put a brick in and said, make this. It's nice when you find these colours. There are some colours like burnt almond, which feature on both these cars, and Roman purple, which you might see in the top 10 of the DBS V8, oddly enough, which hardly exists these days. They've been repainted quite often.
I really like some of those early colours, that mink and burnt almond. That are really, look really period now, don't they? They're lovely colours. Yeah.
Yeah. On the DBS V8, you had 11 in Bahama yellow. That's quite a few, isn't it? and on the DBS, what do you have? You had 9, so a fair number. Yeah, if you go on to the next one, Maria, we'll look at interior trim for the DBS. Obviously, far fewer options than exterior paint, but black is fairly popular. You see quite a lot of black still these days. Very hard to differentiate between some of these, between your fawns and your champagnes and your white golds. It can be tricky. Here we've got the DBS V8 interior trim colours, and very little difference, I would suggest, between these and the 6-cylinder cars.
Chris, Anthony Ode's asking on the chat box, how many Bahama Yellow cars were produced?
Yeah, so 9 6-cylinder, and I think I said 11 V8.
And another question from Anthony is saying about often the early production cars are sort of more pure in their design and lauded as being the best to drive. What's your view, Chris, about I don't know if you've driven a V8 versus a 6-cylinder. What have you got an opinion on?
No, I'm not one to talk to about driving them. Yeah, I think the early cars are quite often pure, and that goes for most models, but it's not always the case.
I mean, my experience of driving them, I have to say that the engines actually were a very similar weight, and it was the embarrassing fact was that Aston didn't publicise the DBS with the straight 6 engine was a slower car than the DB6 with the same engine, because it was a heavier car and it had a bigger frontal area to push along. So it wasn't until the V8 engine went in there that they could properly proclaim that this is a real advancement in every way, and so on, and was the fastest production thing. But I suspect, Anthony, as far as I can remember, and that they drove very similarly. They were certainly very comfortable cars, and they were at the era when you got quite a lot of tyre. It's not like modern days when the tyres are getting thinner and thinner. There's quite a lot of air in the tyre, and with the suspension setup, they were very smooth and easy to use over long distances without making excessive noise. Over they were proper long distance touring cars that worked very well. Yeah.
Here we've just split left-hand drive, right-hand drive, and coincidentally, it's left-hand drive makes up 23% exactly of each model, so about a quarter.
That's interesting, because I didn't realise that. So there were many more right-hand drive cars built than there were left-hand drives in that era. Yeah.
Next slide. See what we've got. Any other ones? Let's have a look. Okay, so the DBS.
That's all the slides I've got, I think.
So the DBS V8 exterior colours are very similar to the DBS ones.
All right. So thank you, Chris. Anyway, that's really helpful for giving insight into what it was like in the late 60s, because they were built, you see, from 1967 right through to 1971, 72, when the company changed hands. So there's quite a span. But I say that really was then the end of the David Brown era, and the company moved on. So I don't know if anyone who's online here has got any particular questions for Chris or myself in relation to these cars. We'd be very happy to try and answer them.
We often get asked how many DBS in particular remain, because certainly a sizable number have been dismantled over the years compared to other Aston Martin models. And that's a hard number to come up with. We don't have a number at the moment, but as time progresses, we get closer and closer to finding a number. I can tell you that we have 7 DBS that have been changed to convertible specification, which of course wasn't available at the time, and 2 DBS V8s I think that we know of are now soft top. And then we have a number of DBS chassis which have been converted into all sorts of replicas, like DBR1s and DB4 GTs.
Right.
And I've got 11, I think, in a list there, which have been morphed into something like that.
Right. Yeah.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Okay. The name's Arnold. I just have a question regarding the mechanical fuel pump on a DBS V8. As mentioned earlier, Mercedes used the same principle, but the point is, I've spoken to Andy Chapman years and years ago about this leveling system of oil in the fuel pump, and the oil level is going up. Have there been any ideas around about lowering the oil pressure from the engine to the oil pump, because the Mercedes item is using around 40 psi, the Aston system is using around 80 till 90 psi when on the run. And this rises the oil level in the fuel pump, and thus enriching the fuel amount.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on with your analysis, and I think that's what people have learned a bit more about since those days, to be able to make them work better. And there's nobody more knowledgeable than Andy Chapman. He was responsible for when they ran that Aston Martin engine I talked about earlier in the Lola at Le Mans. He was the chap who was there helping them to get it in the best state of tune. But yes, that was exactly that which you just described is exactly a problem which was with the system. But I'm not sufficiently technically involved with what they've done in between, but they've definitely done some things. The chap who worked on my car was Tim Butcher at Trinity Engineering, and he did whatever, which I don't know, unfortunately, things to make it work better. But I can tell you that when people were following me on the London to Edinburgh trip, they complained about my exhaust smells, because it absolutely wasn't environmentally friendly. You could smell unburned fuel and oil and stuff that was getting through the engine, which probably helped to lube the top end of the engine, do all sorts of things so it wasn't going to wear out in a hurry. But they were not clean engines. They were just designed to burn a lot of fuel and be very fast. I think in standard form, they produced, although they never declared it at the time, they think they produced the V8 at the time with the injection system on it, about 315 brake horsepower. And yet when they fitted it to the Lola at Le Mans and gave it everything, they reckon that was developing about 450 brake horsepower. But when you went over to carburetors later to make it easier to maintain and to run, you had a serious power deficiency compared to the injected cars. And I remember when first time I went to Le Mans, actually shows how old I was in the late late 1970s. I took my which was then a Weber V8 car. It was a company development car, and had a bit of a drag race with a bloke with a mechanical injected V8, and he was significantly quicker than my car. So.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions?
We've got a question from Steve Goodman. He says, can you talk about what the cars are like to drive, brakes, acceleration, etc.?
Shall I take that, Chris? Or?
No, you take that. That's fine.
Okay. I think the joy, as I said earlier, with the V8 car in particular, which I've driven the most, is that the brakes are absolutely man enough. They made both on the on the DBS, of course, power steering was completely standardized. Air conditioning, the size of the wheels and tires, the whole thing was way over what any normal car would have been in period, and that makes it completely pleasant to use now, 50 years later. And there were, I suppose, the only thing that you'd find compared to a modern car now is the clutch is much heavier than any of us would be used to today. But as far as the experience, once the car's rolling, going along, it's a fabulous thing to use. You can feel the power, and it's enormously comfortable over long distances, which was exactly their ambition.
We've got another question from Vinay Abril. I've seen some DBS Vantages for sale on occasion. Can you talk about these cars and how they differ from non-Vantage cars?
Do you want to take that, Chris?
So for the DBS, you've got cars that run on SUs and you've got cars that run on Weber carbs, and the Vantage are the ones that run on the Weber carbs, and they have different cams as well. So for the Vantage, you'll be seeing the Weber carbs and different cams. You do have some very few emission control cars in the US, or originally for the US, that had non-SU, non-Weber carbs. But yeah, normally you'll see SU carbs for the non-Vantage and Weber for the Vantage.
Yeah. At one point, they didn't used to differentiate. I can't remember which model it was now, but at one point, the company didn't used to make a difference in price between a Vantage and a normal car. It was just a personal choice about whether you wanted to use it about town with an automatic gearbox than the lower rated engine, or whether you wanted to be a bit of a cowboy and race it round, in which case you could have the Vantage spec and all the things that might have gone with that cost you more in fuel and a bit more maintenance. Because the maintenance on these cars was quite shocking in period, in that now you couldn't believe it, that every 2,500 miles you were supposed to have it serviced, and that was just to look it over and fiddle with the oil, and every 5,000 miles they did something a bit more serious. But I mean, the idea was, if you want to keep it under warranty, these cars had to be maintained almost on a continuous basis. Totally different to today. Yeah.
We've got another question from Roger Napier. He says, when thinking about long-term ownership, if the sills are properly refurbished and rust-proofed, how long are they likely to last before rusting out again?
I think the answer to that is a great deal longer than they ever would have done for anything coming out of the factory, because now with the sort of treatments you can give and paint things all over, I don't know a precise time, but the answer is quite a long time if it's done properly, and particularly if you avoid using the car in salty, any sort of salty conditions. If you just keep rainwater and keep it clean in general and in a good environment, I think the sills will last quite a long time. But as they came out of the factory, they would, within the space of 2 or 3 years, they'd be going quite horribly rusty. Yeah. Any more questions, Maria, on the chat box?
No, that's all the questions I can see for now, unless anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask something directly.
Could I just go back to Arnold's question, please?
Yes, please.
Arnold, were you saying that the increase in oil pressure within the engine increases the oil pressure in the mechanical fuel pump and therefore enriches the air-to-fuel mixture? Is that what Arnold said earlier?
Arnold, I think you're on mute. If you could unmute yourself.
Does anybody else?
Well, yeah, my understanding, Ian, is...
Sorry, here I am. You're perfectly right in assuming that the 90 psi from the engine of the V8 is the double from the Mercedes engine, 40 psi. So it's simply pushes in more oil, and after some 1,500 miles, and especially if the pump gets a bit older, you'll find that the oil level is upping itself. So you have to get out the oil with a syringe or something similar to get the pump functioning properly again, because you've got those fly weights at the end, the same things which are being used in an old style automatic gearbox, and as further as the weights come out, the leaner the system becomes. But if the oil comes in, the fly weights don't have the possibility to come out and the mixture is richer and not becoming leaner.
Yeah.
And that's the problem I think is occurring with those engines.
Yeah.
And that was the main reason for me for asking this question. And maybe there could be a second option, not only reducing the pressure, but also limiting it a bit by reducing the hole through which the oil comes. But okay, that's just my way of thinking.
I think you're spot on, Arnold. That exactly complies with stories I've heard too. Yeah.
Okay. I hope the answer's been sufficient.
I thought that there was a separate reservoir for the mechanical fuel pump. Is that incorrect?
No, that is not incorrect. But on the back of the fuel pump, you have a so-called dipstick, a very small one which you have to screw out with a flat screwdriver.
Yeah.
And as I visited Andy Chapman some 16 years ago, as he gave a course in the UK, he told us to leave, at least when you started off with it, to leave the oil level about 1/8 of an inch below the mark on the dipstick to start off with. Otherwise, you would start off too high and you would end up too high. But there is a certain amount of oil to be filled into the fuel pump from new on, and then you'll have this high pressure hose from the right-hand side cylinder head to the fuel pump, to the side of the fuel pump, and that lubricates the plungers in the pump itself. But some of it is going past the plungers and is upping the oil level.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's always a lot of discussions on the fuel injection pump, and a bit like the Vanquish and the gearbox, it's one of those topics which you can spend a lot of time on.
But I think ultimately what I think is impressive is just how robust and reliable these engines have been over such a long time. You know, that V8 engine was the basis of all Aston Martin engines right through to the last of the Virage cars. And it was an interesting anecdote is that Tadek Marek was so depressed when the cars failed at Le Mans, because it was such a public humiliation for himself and for the company, that he was all for packing it up, and David Brown had to personally go and stroke him and wipe his brow and say, look, for goodness sake, you know, we're going to support you. This engine can be fixed. And that was when I think the necessary funding and the redesign of the engine, it was the best thing that could have happened, as I said earlier, that the engine was taken right back to first principles and beefed up and made the lovely, robust unit that we've all enjoyed since. Yeah.
Okay.
We've got a question from Bruce Douglas. He says, on the durability of the sills once replaced, I replaced mine over 30 years ago and they are still good. I injected the new sills with wax oil and it does what it says on the tin.
Well, look, Bruce, that's excellent. We got 30 years. You can't argue with that. Well done. That's brilliant. But it just shows, though, the difference in paint systems. I mean, it always astonishes me now. You see, you know, the new generation Minis that BMW put together in Oxford, and you see those cars 20 years old, and there's not a mark on them. They paint them brilliantly, like BMW themselves do, and Mercedes and other manufacturers today. There's just no comparison with what used to happen in the 60s and 70s, and modern paints and paint systems are brilliant.
I think that's all the questions so far.
Right. Well, I think if everybody's satisfied and they've got nothing else that we can answer them, I'd like to thank you all for being here and hopefully for enjoying our little presentation. And, you know, if you've got questions that you think of outside of this, you can always contact me via the club. I'm very happy to try and support. And I'd like to thank Mark Donoghue for coming up with this initiative in the first place, because I think as far as we've had meetings and that I've largely been party to, but just as an innocent observer up to now, it's been a very successful initiative. And I've enjoyed it, and I hope everyone else has enjoyed it. Do you want to say a few words, Mark, before we sign off?
Thank you. No, thank you.
No, all right. I'm upset you now.
Next week we're doing the Gaydon DBS, so the DBS V12 and DBS Superleggera. So we will be back next week at 11 o'clock. I've asked Anthony Ode, who's on here today. Good morning, Anthony. He's going to host it, and that should be quite an interesting one too, in comparison with today. It's not in comparison, saying yours was bad. In contrast, sorry, with today. Sorry, Tom. Thanks, Tom.
Two different DBSs. Well, thank everyone for your contribution. Thank you as well, Maria, for helping to pull it all together. And everyone, enjoy the rest of your Sunday. I look forward to seeing you this time next week. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.